Some memories refuse to fade, no matter how many years pass or how desperately you try to forget them. What I'm about to tell you happened nearly 3 decades ago, but I remember every detail as clearly as if it were yesterday. My name is Vincent, and in the summer of 1996, when I was 19 years old, I took a job that would change my understanding of reality forever. The position seemed perfect at the time. I needed money for college, and the ranger station was hearing seasonal fire lookouts for the remote observation posts scattered throughout the Cascade Wilderness. The pay was decent, and the job description made it sound almost romantic. Spend your summer in solitude, they said. Watch over the forest, they said. Report any signs of smoke or unusual activity. It sounded like an adventure, a chance to spend 3 months disconnected from the world, alone with my thoughts and the endless expanse of trees. I had no idea what I was walking into. The training lasted only 2 days. A gruff ranger named Patterson showed me how to operate the radio equipment, how to use the compass and topographic maps, and how to identify different types of smoke from various distances. He explained the daily routine, the check-in procedures, and the emergency protocols. But there was something he did not tell me, something I would discover on my own. Something that made me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world, and what might exist just beyond the edge of our perception. On my 3rd day, a helicopter dropped me off at Tower 12, my home for the next 90 days. The structure stood 70 feet tall, a wooden skeleton topped with a small cabin that offered a 360-degree view of the surrounding wilderness. The nearest road was 15 miles away. The nearest town was 40 miles beyond that. I was truly alone, more alone than I had ever been in my entire life. At 19, I thought I understood solitude. I thought I knew what it meant to be isolated. I was wrong. The helicopter pilot helped me unload my supplies. Boxes of canned food, water containers, batteries, fuel for the propane stove, and various other essentials that would sustain me through the summer. As he prepared to leave, he gave me one last piece of advice that seemed casual at the time but would later echo in my mind with terrible significance. "Keep to yourself up here," he said, his voice barely audible over the spinning rotors. "Do not go wandering around at night, and if you see anything strange, anything at all, you radio it in immediately. Understood?" I nodded, thinking he was talking about bears or maybe illegal hunters. I had no idea what he really meant. The helicopter lifted off, the sound of its rotors fading into the distance until I was left in complete silence. The kind of silence that most people never experience in their lives. The kind that presses against your eardrums and makes you aware of your own heartbeat. The first week passed uneventfully. I fell into a comfortable rhythm that defined my days and gave structure to the isolation. Each morning, I woke at 6 a.m. to the sound of birds calling from the trees below. I would make instant coffee on the small propane stove, the steam fogging up the windows of the cabin until I opened them to let in the cool mountain air. The smell of pine and earth would rush in, fresh and clean, reminding me why I had wanted this job in the first place. Then I would spend the next hour scanning the horizon with binoculars, looking for any wisp of smoke that might indicate a fire. This was my primary responsibility, the reason I was being paid to sit in this tower day after day. Forest fires could start from lightning strikes, from careless campers, from a dozen different sources, and they could spread with terrifying speed if not caught early. My job was to be the early warning system, the eyes that watched over thousands of acres of wilderness. The view from Tower 12 was breathtaking. Miles and miles of unbroken forest stretched in every direction, an ocean of green that rolled over hills and valleys like frozen waves. On clear days, I could see distant mountain peaks touching the sky, their snow-capped summits gleaming white against the blue expanse. On foggy mornings, the tower seemed to float above a sea of white clouds, isolated and ethereal. It was beautiful and peaceful, and for those first 7 days, I felt lucky to have this job. I felt like I had escaped the noise and confusion of normal life and found something pure and simple. The radio was my only connection to the outside world. Twice daily, at 8 a.m. and 6 p.m., I would check in with the ranger station. The routine was always the same. I would key the microphone, identify myself, report any fires or unusual conditions, and confirm that I was healthy and safe. Patterson would acknowledge my transmission, provide any updates or weather information, and sign off. These brief conversations became the highlights of my day, small reminders that I was still part of the human world. I would also communicate with the other lookout towers scattered throughout the forest. There was Tower 9, operated by a woman named Sarah who had been doing this job for 5 summers. She had a warm, friendly voice that made me feel less alone during those first days. She would share stories about wildlife she had seen, about the changing seasons in the forest, about the peace she found in the solitude. I looked forward to our brief exchanges. There was Tower 15, where an older man named George spent his retirement watching over the trees he had protected his entire career. George was less talkative than Sarah, but his presence on the radio was reassuring. He knew these forests better than anyone, and his calm, professional demeanor made me feel like I was part of a long tradition of guardians who had watched over this wilderness. And there was Tower 6, the closest to my position, only about 8 miles away as the crow flies, but I never spoke to whoever operated Tower 6. My attempts to make contact were always met with silence. At first, I thought maybe the tower was unoccupied this season. Budget cuts had closed some of the more remote positions, but Patterson mentioned during one of our check-ins that Tower 6 was active, that someone was stationed there, just not very sociable. I found that strange but did not push the issue. People came to these jobs for different reasons, and if whoever was at Tower 6 wanted to be left alone, that was their choice. On the 8th day, something changed. Something that would shatter the peace I had found and replace it with a growing sense of dread that I could not shake no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it away. I was performing my morning scan when I noticed them. 3 figures standing at the edge of a clearing, roughly half a mile from the base of my tower. At first, I assumed they were hikers who had wandered off the main trails. But something about them seemed wrong. They were not moving. They were not setting up camp or consulting a map or doing any of the things hikers normally do. They were just standing there, perfectly still, facing my direction. I watched them through the binoculars for nearly 20 minutes. They did not move a single inch. Their posture remained rigid and unnatural. I could not make out any details of their faces or clothing from this distance, but their shapes were definitely human, or at least they appeared human. The longer I watched them, the more unsettled I became. There was something about their stillness that felt wrong, almost predatory, like animals that freeze when they detect a threat. I decided to report it during my morning check-in. When Patterson came on the radio, I kept my voice casual and professional, not wanting to sound alarmist or paranoid. Tower 12 to base, I have eyes on what appears to be 3 individuals in Sector 7 Delta, approximately 0.5 miles from my position. They have been stationary for over 20 minutes. Should I be concerned? Over. There was a pause before Patterson responded. His voice sounded dismissive, almost annoyed, like I was wasting his time with trivial matters. Base to Tower 12, probably just some backpackers taking a rest. Keep monitoring and report if they start a fire or show signs of distress. Otherwise, do not worry about it. Over. I wanted to argue, to explain that something felt off about these figures, that their behavior was not normal, that the way they stood there motionless was deeply unsettling. But I held back. It was only my 8th day on the job. I did not want to sound paranoid or incompetent. I did not want Patterson to think I could not handle the isolation. So I acknowledged the transmission and went back to my duties, trying to convince myself that he was right, that they were just tired hikers taking a break. But throughout the day, I kept returning to that clearing with my binoculars. The figures remained in the exact same position until late afternoon when I looked again and found them gone. The clearing was empty, with no sign that anyone had ever been there. No tents, no backpacks, no trampled grass or disturbed earth. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. I told myself they had moved on, continued their hike, disappeared back into the endless forest. But a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that something else was happening, something I did not understand. That night I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking about those motionless figures and the uneasy feeling they had given me. The tower creaked and groaned in the wind, sounds I had grown accustomed to over the past week. Every building makes noise, especially wooden structures that expand and contract with temperature changes. I knew this intellectually, but now every noise seemed amplified, potentially threatening. I found myself listening for footsteps on the stairs that wrapped around the outside of the tower, even though I knew that was irrational. I kept getting up to check the door lock, making sure it was secure, peering out the windows into the darkness below. The forest at night is a different world. During the day, it seems welcoming, almost benign, but at night it transforms into something else. The darkness between the trees becomes absolute, impenetrable. Sounds carry differently. The calls of nocturnal animals echo in strange ways. Your imagination begins to populate that darkness with threats that may or may not be real. I understood this. I had read about it during my training. Isolation and darkness can play tricks on your mind. But understanding something intellectually and experiencing it emotionally are two very different things. The next morning they were back. This time they were closer, much closer. The three figures stood in a different location, only a quarter-mile from the tower. Once again, they were perfectly still, facing in my direction. I could make out more details now through the binoculars. They wore dark clothing that seemed to absorb the morning light rather than reflect it. Their heads were covered with hoods or hats that obscured their faces completely. And there was something about their proportions that seemed slightly off, though I could not pinpoint exactly what bothered me about them. Their limbs seemed too long, or their torsos too narrow, or their heads tilted at angles that did not look quite natural. I grabbed the radio immediately, my hands shaking slightly as I pressed the transmit button. Tower 12 to Tower 9, this is Vincent. Do you copy? Over. Sarah's voice came through clearly, as warm and friendly as always. Tower 9 copies. What is going on, Vincent? Over. I have been seeing some figures near my tower for the past 2 days. 3 of them always standing completely still, always facing my direction. They are getting closer. Have you experienced anything like this? Over. There was a longer pause than I expected. When Sarah finally responded, her voice had lost some of its friendly warmth. There was a note of concern in her tone, but also something else. Caution, perhaps, or reluctance. Vincent, how long have you been up there alone? Over. The question caught me off guard. It seemed to imply something I did not like. 9 days now. Why? Over. The isolation can play tricks on your mind, especially if this is your first time doing this kind of work. I have seen it happen before. New lookouts start seeing things that are not there, or they misinterpret normal forest activity as something threatening. My advice is to stay busy, keep to your routine, and do not let your imagination run wild. Trust me, after a few weeks you will get used to it. Over. I felt frustration rising in my chest, a hot feeling that made my face flush. She thought I was imagining things. She thought I was some naive kid who could not handle being alone. I know what I am seeing, Sarah. These are not tricks of the mind. There are 3 figures out there and they are definitely real. They were there yesterday for hours and they are there again today, closer than before. Over. Okay, Vincent, okay. I am not trying to dismiss what you are experiencing. Just stay calm and keep reporting to base during your regular check-ins. And if you need someone to talk to, I am here. Sometimes it helps just to have a conversation, to hear another human voice. Tower 9 out. The conversation left me feeling more isolated than before. Nobody believed me. Or worse, they thought I was losing my grip on reality after only 9 days of solitude. They thought I was weak, unable to handle the job I had been hired to do. The frustration mixed with doubt. Was I seeing things? Was my mind playing tricks on me? I picked up the binoculars again and focused on the clearing. No, they were there. 3 dark figures standing motionless, watching my tower. They were real. I was sure of it. Before you think I am crazy too, let me ask you something. Have you ever experienced something that you knew was real but nobody else would believe you? If you have, then maybe you will understand what I went through. And if you are enjoying this story so far, please consider hitting that subscribe button. I share true experiences like this one, and your support means everything to me. It helps me reach others who might have similar stories, who might need to know they are not alone. Now, let me continue. I spent the rest of that day documenting everything. I made detailed notes in my logbook, recording the exact time and location of each sighting. I sketched rough diagrams showing the positions of the figures relative to the tower. I even tried to take photographs, but the distance was too great and my camera was not powerful enough to capture anything useful. The photos showed only indistinct dark shapes that could have been anything. Shadows, tree stumps, rocks. There was no detail, no proof that what I was seeing was actually there. During my evening check-in with base, I reported the figures again. Patterson's response was even more dismissive than before, tinged with irritation that barely concealed his annoyance. Tower 12, you need to focus on your actual job. We did not send you up there to track hikers. Watch for fires and leave the campers alone. If these people are not in distress and are not starting fires, they are not your concern. Understood. Base out. The abrupt sign-off stung. I had been dismissed, my concerns brushed aside as if they were meaningless. The message was clear. Do your job, stop complaining, stop bothering us with irrelevant observations. I sat in the cabin as darkness fell, feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. The radio sat on the table, silent and useless. My only connection to the outside world, and nobody on the other end wanted to listen. That night I barely slept at all. I kept the lights off in the cabin and sat by the window, watching the forest below. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the treetops. The shadows were deep and black, creating patterns that seemed to shift and move when I was not looking directly at them. Around 2 a.m. I thought I saw movement near the base of the tower. Dark shapes shifting between the trees, too coordinated to be animals, too purposeful to be random. But whenever I focused the binoculars on a specific spot, there was nothing there, just shadows and moonlight playing across the landscape. I began to doubt myself. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe the isolation was affecting me. Maybe I was seeing patterns where none existed, interpreting normal forest activity as something threatening because my mind was starved for stimulation and was creating drama to fill the void. But even as I tried to convince myself of this, I could not shake the feeling that something was watching me. The sensation was physical, like pressure on my skin, like invisible eyes boring into me from the darkness below. The 10th day brought a development that made my blood run cold and confirmed that whatever was happening was not a product of my imagination. During my morning scan, I found the figures again, but now there were not 3 of them. There were 7. And they had moved even closer, now positioned less than 500 feet from the tower. They formed a rough semicircle, all facing toward me, all perfectly motionless. The 4 new figures looked identical to the original 3, dark and hooded and unsettlingly still. The pattern of their arrangement seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic, like they were performing some kind of ceremony or following rules that I could not comprehend. My hands shook as I reached for the radio. I tried Tower 9 first, pressing the transmit button and calling Sarah's designation. Static. I tried again, adjusting the frequency slightly. More static. I tried Tower 15, calling for George. Nothing. I even tried the silent Tower 6, hoping that whoever was there might respond to an emergency call. Silence. The radio seemed to be working fine. All the indicators showed normal function. The power light was on, the frequency display was clear, the speaker crackled with background noise. But I could not raise anyone. It was as if every other lookout tower had suddenly been abandoned, as if I was the only person left in the entire forest. The isolation that had seemed peaceful during my first week now felt oppressive and threatening, like I was being deliberately cut off from the outside world. I tried the base station, my voice rising with panic that I could not quite control. Tower 12 to base, this is an emergency. I need immediate assistance. The situation has escalated. Over. Static. Base, do you copy? This is Tower 12 requesting immediate contact. Over. More static. I checked every setting, every connection, every switch. I changed batteries even though the power indicator showed they were fine. I adjusted the antenna, turned the radio off and on again, went through every troubleshooting step I had been taught during training. The radio appeared to be functioning perfectly on my end, but nobody was responding. The silence was deafening, more terrifying than any sound could have been. I made a decision that I would later question many times. I decided to stay inside the tower, keep the door locked, and wait for the regular supply helicopter that was scheduled to arrive in 5 days. Surely I could last 5 more days. The tower was secure. I had plenty of food and water, and nothing could climb the smooth metal legs that supported the structure 70 feet above the ground. The cabin had solid walls, a good lock on the door, windows that could be secured. I was safe up here. I just needed to wait. That assumption proved to be wrong. On the 11th day, the figures multiplied again. Now there were at least 15 of them, maybe more. They surrounded the tower completely, forming a wide circle in the clearing below. And for the first time, they moved. Not much, just a slow, synchronized shifting that brought them all a few feet closer to the tower's base. The movement was so coordinated, so perfectly timed, that it looked choreographed. Like a ritual dance, or a military formation, or something else that followed rules and patterns I could not understand. I watched through the binoculars, my heart hammering in my chest so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands trembled, making the image jump and shake. I had to rest the binoculars on the windowsill to steady them. As the figures moved, I finally got a clear look at one of their faces. What I saw made me drop the binoculars and stumble backward, my breath coming in short gasps. It was not a face, not really. It was a smooth, featureless oval where a face should have been. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a blank surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, like looking into a void, into nothingness. And yet, despite the absence of eyes, I could feel it watching me. I could feel all of them watching me. Their eyeless faces turned toward the tower with an intensity that was almost physical. The sensation made my skin crawl, made every instinct scream at me to run, to hide, to escape. The radio suddenly crackled to life, making me jump so violently that I knocked over my coffee mug. The sound was unexpected, shocking after hours of silence. But instead of a voice, all I heard was a low, rhythmic sound. It took me a moment to recognize it. Breathing. Slow, steady breathing, as if someone was holding down the transmit button on their radio while they breathed into the microphone. The sound continued for nearly a minute, each breath deliberate and measured, before cutting off abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound itself. I did not sleep that night. I could not. Sleep seemed impossible, a luxury I could not afford. I sat in the center of the cabin with every light turned on, the binoculars in my lap, checking the clearing below every few minutes. The figures remained in their circle, motionless once again, waiting. The word kept echoing in my mind. They were waiting. But for what? What were they waiting for? Around 4 a.m., I heard the first sound on the stairs. It was soft, almost imperceptible. A faint scraping noise like something dragging across metal. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, that my exhausted mind was creating sounds where none existed. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. Something was on the stairs that wrapped around the outside of the tower. Something was climbing toward me. I grabbed the only weapon I had, a heavy flashlight, and moved to the door. My entire body was shaking. The scraping sound continued, slow and deliberate, getting closer with each passing minute. I could track its progress by the sound. It had reached the first landing, then the second, then the third. The tower had 6 levels of stairs before reaching the cabin at the top. Whatever was climbing was now on the 4th level. I could hear it clearly now, not just scraping, but also a wet, sliding sound that made my skin crawl. It was not footsteps. It was something else, something that moved differently than a human should move. Something that dragged itself up the stairs with an unnatural rhythm that sent primal fear shooting through my nervous system. Fifth level. I pressed my back against the far wall, the flashlight held up like a club, my eyes locked on the door. The lock was simple, just a basic latch that could probably be forced open without much effort. My mind raced through options. The windows were too small to climb through. There was no other exit. If whatever was out there wanted to get in, I had nowhere to run. I was trapped in a metal box 70 feet in the air, with something climbing toward me that I did not understand and could not fight. Sixth level. The scraping stopped. For a long moment there was only silence. My own breathing sounded deafening in the quiet cabin. I could hear my heart pounding, could feel the blood rushing through my veins. Then I heard it, breathing. The same slow, steady breathing I had heard on the radio. It was right outside my door, separated from me by only a few inches of wood and a simple latch. The door handle began to turn. I wanted to scream, but my voice was frozen in my throat. Terror had locked my muscles, made my body rigid and unresponsive. I could only watch as the handle rotated slowly, testing the lock. The metal moved with deliberate precision, turning fully to one side, then back to center when it found resistance. The breathing continued, steady and patient. When the handle could not turn anymore, it stopped. The breathing continued for another minute, each breath seeming to fill the entire cabin with its presence, then ceased. I heard the scraping sound again, but this time it was moving away, descending the stairs. I waited until dawn before I dared to move. When the first light of morning touched the windows, turning the darkness into gray twilight, I finally unlocked the door and looked outside. There was nothing on the platform, nothing on the stairs, no sign that anything had been there at all. But when I looked down at the clearing below, the circle of figures had grown larger. There were now at least 30 of them. And they were closer than before. The psychological warfare continued through day 12. The figures maintained their circle during daylight hours, but something had changed about their formation. They had arranged themselves in a specific pattern, one that seemed deliberate and meaningful. From my elevated position, I could see that they formed symbols or letters, though I could not make sense of what they spelled. The shapes reminded me of ancient runes or petroglyphs, symbols that predated written language and carried meanings I could not comprehend. The radio remained silent except for occasional bursts of that disturbing breathing sound. Sometimes it would come at random hours, sometimes in patterns that seemed to follow a rhythm I could almost but not quite grasp. I stopped trying to make contact. The radio had become a source of dread rather than comfort. Instead, I focused on survival. I rationed my food and water carefully, even though the supply helicopter was supposed to arrive in just 3 more days. 3 more days suddenly seemed like an eternity, an impossible distance to cross. That afternoon, around 3 p.m., something new happened. One of the figures separated from the circle and walked toward the tower. It moved smoothly, without the natural bounce and sway of human movement. It simply glided across the ground as if its feet were not quite touching the earth, as if gravity affected it differently than it should. When it reached the base of the tower, it stopped and tilted its head upward. Even from 70 feet above, even through the binoculars, I could feel its eyeless gaze fixed on me. Then it raised one arm and pointed directly at the cabin. The gesture was so human, so simple and clear that it somehow made the whole situation more terrifying. This was not an animal acting on instinct. This was something intelligent, something that was trying to communicate. But what was it trying to say? Was it a warning, a threat, an invitation? I could not tell, and the ambiguity was maddening. The figure remained in that position, arm raised, pointing at me for the rest of the afternoon. When darkness fell, I could still see its dark silhouette against the slightly lighter ground, still pointing, still watching. The other figures maintained their circle, unmoving. The entire scene had a ritualistic quality that made me think of ancient ceremonies, of sacrifices and offerings. of practices that civilized humans had abandoned millennia ago, but that perhaps still existed in places like this, in the deep wilderness where human rules did not apply. That night they all climbed the tower at once. I heard them coming around midnight, not just one set of scraping sounds, but dozens. They were ascending from all sides, surrounding the tower as they climbed. The noise was overwhelming, a chorus of wet sliding and metallic scraping that grew louder with each passing second. The entire structure seemed to vibrate with their movement, the metal legs resonating with the sound of their ascent. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my emergency flare gun, the one piece of equipment I was supposed to use only in case of fire or medical emergency. My hands fumbled with the mechanism as I loaded it, my fingers clumsy with fear. I unlocked the door, stepped out onto the platform, and fired the flare straight up into the night sky. The flare burst above the trees in a brilliant red explosion that turned night into day for a few brief seconds. The entire forest was illuminated in crimson light that cast stark shadows and revealed every detail with horrible clarity. In that light, I saw them. There were figures covering the entire structure of the tower, clinging to the stairs and railings with hands that had too many fingers, fingers that bent at wrong angles, fingers that gripped the metal with impossible strength. Their faceless heads all turned toward me in perfect unison as the flare reached its peak and began to fall. Then they started screaming. It was not a human sound. It was something else entirely, a high-pitched wailing that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the figures themselves and from the forest and from the very air. The noise was so intense that I dropped the flare gun and covered my ears, but it did not help. The sound penetrated through my hands, through the walls of the cabin, through my very skull. It felt like my brain was vibrating inside my head, like my thoughts were being scrambled by the intensity of the sound. I fell to my knees, overwhelmed by the sensory assault, unable to do anything but endure. And then they retreated. As the flare descended and the light faded, returning the world to darkness, the figures released their grip on the tower and dropped toward the ground. But they did not fall like living things should fall. They simply descended smoothly, as if gravity affected them differently, as if they existed partially outside the normal laws of physics. They landed silently in the clearing below, absorbing the impact without sound or visible trauma. Within seconds, they had reformed their circle and returned to their motionless vigil. The sudden silence was almost as shocking as the screaming had been. I stood on the platform, my ears ringing, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold onto the railing. My legs felt weak, barely able to support my weight. I looked down at the clearing and saw something that made my situation even worse. The flare had ignited a patch of dry brush near the edge of the trees. Small flames were spreading, licking at the undergrowth, threatening to grow into something larger. I had started a fire. I had done the one thing I was supposed to prevent. The irony was not lost on me, but there was no time to appreciate it. If that fire spread, if it grew into a real blaze, it could consume thousands of acres. People could die. The forest I was supposed to protect could burn. I ran back into the cabin and grabbed the radio, knowing it was useless but trying anyway. Desperation made me irrational. Tower 12 to base, I have a fire situation in Sector 7 Delta. I repeat, we have a fire situation. I need immediate assistance. Over. Static. Tower 12 to any station, if anyone can hear me, there is a fire starting near my position. Please respond. Over. Nothing, just the empty hiss of dead air. I watched helplessly as the flames grew brighter in the darkness. The figures in the clearing did not move. They did not react to the fire at all. They just stood there, watching me watch them, as the forest began to burn around them. Their indifference was somehow more disturbing than if they had fled or attacked. It suggested that the fire was not a threat to them, that they existed outside the normal dangers that threatened living things. I made a decision that I knew was insane even as I made it. I grabbed the fire extinguisher from its mount on the wall, the one I was supposed to use only for fires inside the cabin. My hands moved automatically, driven by training and duty that overrode my terror. I unlocked the door and ran down the stairs, my feet pounding on the metal steps, driven by a sense of responsibility that was stronger than my fear. I had to put out that fire. It was my job. It was why I was here. The figures watched me descend but did not move from their positions. I could feel their attention focused on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl, made every hair on my body stand on end. But they did not approach as I ran past them toward the burning brush. They maintained their circle, their vigil, as if they were observers rather than participants, as if they were watching to see what I would do. The fire extinguisher worked, spraying white foam that smothered the flames within minutes. I moved methodically, covering every ember, every spark, making sure nothing remained that could reignite. When the last ember was extinguished, I stood in the darkness, breathing hard, suddenly aware of how exposed I was. I had left the safety of the tower. I was on the ground, surrounded by those things, with nothing between us but a few dozen yards of empty space. I turned slowly, expecting to find them right behind me. My heart hammered as I completed the rotation, sure that I would come face to face with those blank, eyeless surfaces. But they had not moved. They remained in their circle, maintaining the same positions they had held before. The figure that had pointed at me earlier was still pointing, its arm raised, its faceless head tilted upward toward the empty platform where I had been standing. I ran back to the tower and climbed the stairs faster than I had ever climbed anything in my life. My lungs burned and my legs screamed in protest, my muscles flooded with adrenaline that gave me strength beyond my normal capacity. I did not stop until I was back inside the cabin with the door locked behind me. Only then did I allow myself to collapse on the floor, gasping for breath, my entire body trembling with exhaustion and fear, and the delayed shock of what I had just done. The figures remained in their circle until dawn. I watched them through the window, unable to sleep, unable to look away. When the sun finally rose on day 13, turning the sky pink and gold, they were gone. The clearing was empty. There was no sign that anything had been there at all. No footprints in the soft earth, no disturbed vegetation, no physical evidence of their presence. It was as if they had never existed. I spent that day in a state of numb shock, going through the motions of my duties like a robot. I scanned the forest for fires. I made notes in my logbook. I ate food that tasted like nothing that I had to force myself to swallow. The radio remained silent. The sky remained empty. The supply helicopter did not come. That evening, during the time when I would normally check in with base, the radio suddenly crackled to life on its own. I had not touched it, had not even been near it. Patterson's voice came through, clear and urgent, cutting through the static with startling clarity. Tower 12, this is base. Vincent, if you can hear this, we are sending an emergency extraction team. They will arrive at first light tomorrow. Do not leave the tower for any reason. Acknowledge if you copy. Over. I grabbed the microphone with shaking hands, my voice hoarse from lack of use. Base, this is Tower 12. I copy your transmission. Please confirm, are you reading me? Over. We read you, Vincent. We read you loud and clear. Sit tight. Help is coming. We are going to get you out of there. Base out. The transmission ended. I sat in the silence that followed, holding the microphone, wondering if what I had just heard was real or if my mind had finally broken under the stress of isolation and terror. Had Patterson really said they were sending an extraction team? Or had I imagined it, my desperate brain creating the rescue I so desperately needed? That night the figures returned for a final performance. But this time, there were hundreds of them. They filled the clearing, spreading out into the trees, creating a vast crowd of dark, faceless shapes that surrounded the tower on all sides. And they were not still anymore. They were moving, swaying in unison, performing some kind of synchronized dance or ritual that seemed to pulse with meaning I could not understand. I watched from the window, unable to look away despite my fear. There was a pattern to their movement, a rhythm that my mind tried to grasp but could not quite hold. It was like watching water flow, or smoke rise, or any other natural phenomenon that follows rules too complex for human comprehension. The movement was mesmerizing and horrible at the same time, beautiful in its coordination, but terrifying in its implication that these things operated according to laws I did not understand. Around 3 a.m., they all stopped moving at once. The sudden stillness was jarring after hours of continuous motion. The silence pressed against my eardrums with almost physical force. Then, as one, they all raised their arms and pointed at the tower. Hundreds of fingers aimed at me like weapons, like accusations, like markers identifying a target. The message was clear, even if I did not understand what it meant. They were acknowledging me, recognizing my presence, making it known that I was seen. I sat in the center of the cabin and waited for dawn. It was the longest night of my life. Minutes stretched into hours. Each second felt like it lasted forever. I did not dare close my eyes. I barely dared to breathe. I just sat there, watching the figures point at me, counting down the hours until sunrise. When the sun finally rose on day 14, I heard the most beautiful sound imaginable. The distant thump of helicopter rotors cutting through the morning air, growing louder as it approached. I ran to the window and saw it flying low over the trees, heading straight for my tower. A Ranger Service helicopter, marked with official insignia, real and solid and undeniably part of the normal world I had left behind 2 weeks ago. The figures were still there, still pointing, but they did not react as the helicopter descended toward the clearing. The pilot had to navigate carefully, finding a space among them to land. I could see his face through the windshield, focused and professional, showing no sign that he saw anything unusual. The helicopter touched down, and 2 Rangers jumped out, moving quickly toward the tower. I grabbed my backpack, threw in my few personal belongings, and ran down the stairs to meet them. My legs were unsteady after so many days confined to the cabin, and I nearly fell twice on the descent. One of the Rangers caught my arm as I stumbled off the last step, his grip strong and reassuring, his touch the first human contact I had experienced in 14 days. "Are you all right? Can you walk?" His voice was professional but concerned, scanning my face for signs of distress or injury. I nodded, unable to find words. My voice seemed to have abandoned me. I looked around the clearing, expecting to see the figures, needing someone else to confirm that they were real. But there was nothing. The forest was empty except for the 4 of us and the waiting helicopter. The ground showed no signs of disturbance, no indication that hundreds of entities had been standing here just moments ago. "We need to move now," the pilot said, his voice urgent. "Weather is changing. We have a narrow window to get out of here." I climbed aboard the helicopter, strapping myself into the seat with trembling hands. The Rangers secured the door, gave the pilot a thumbs up, and we lifted off immediately. The helicopter rose above the trees, the tower shrinking below us, the forest spreading out in all directions. As we gained altitude, I looked down at the clearing one last time. For just a moment, I thought I saw them. Hundreds of dark shapes standing among the trees, all with their arms raised, all pointing upward at the departing helicopter. But when I blinked, they were gone. The forest below looked peaceful and empty, just an expanse of green trees under the morning sun. I told myself it was my imagination, my exhausted mind playing final tricks, but I knew what I had seen. Back at the ranger station, Patterson and several other staff members were waiting. They looked relieved to see me, which struck me as odd. If they thought I was just a paranoid kid who could not handle isolation, why would they be relieved? They took me to the medical facility where a doctor examined me. Dehydration, exhaustion, mild malnutrition despite my food supplies, and what they called acute stress reaction. They gave me fluids through an IV, sedatives to help me calm down, and told me to rest. Later that afternoon, after I had slept for several hours, Patterson came to speak with me. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot as he stood at the end of my cot. His eyes would not quite meet mine, and I got the sense that he was struggling with something he did not want to say. "We found evidence of the fire you reported," he said finally. "The extinguisher was empty, and there were scorch marks in Sector 7 Delta. You did the right thing putting it out. Could have been a lot worse if you had not acted quickly." I waited for him to continue, but he seemed reluctant to say more. The silence stretched out between us, heavy with unspoken words. "What about the figures?" I finally asked. "What about everything I reported on the radio, the things I saw every day for almost 2 weeks?" Patterson looked at the floor, his jaw working as if chewing on words he did not want to release. "We did not find any evidence of other people in that area. No footprints, no campsites, no trash, nothing. The forest was empty except for you. We sent a team to do a thorough search after we extracted you. They covered a 5-mile radius around Tower 12. Nothing. But I saw them. Night after night I saw them. They climbed the tower. They surrounded me. They pointed at me." My voice was rising, frustration and fear mixing into something close to anger. "Vincent, you were alone up there for 2 weeks with minimal human contact. The isolation, the responsibility, the solitude, it can do things to your mind. There is no shame in that. It happens to a lot of people who try this work. Some people are just not built for that level of isolation. It does not mean you are weak or crazy. It just means this particular job is not right for you." "So you think I imagined it all?" It was not a question. I could see the answer in his face, in the way he would not look directly at me, in the careful tone of his voice. "I think you experienced something real to you. The mind can create very vivid hallucinations under stress, but there is no physical evidence that anyone else was there. No concrete proof beyond your own perceptions." I wanted to argue, to insist that I knew what I had seen, that the breathing on the radio and the scraping on the stairs and the hundreds of pointing figures were not hallucinations. But I was too exhausted. The sedatives were making my thoughts fuzzy, my reactions slow. Instead, I just nodded and let them believe what they wanted to believe. It was easier than fighting. They sent me home the next day with a check for the full 3 months of pay, even though I had only worked 2 weeks. A gesture of goodwill, they called it, an understanding that the work was not suitable for everyone. Patterson shook my hand and told me there was no shame in what had happened, that many people tried this work and could not handle it. I took the check and left, driving away from the ranger station without looking back. I cashed the check and tried to move on with my life. I enrolled in college as planned, using the money to help pay for tuition and books. I studied, I made friends, I dated. I did all the normal things that 19-year-olds do. But I could not let it go. The experience haunted me, appearing in my dreams, intruding into my thoughts during quiet moments. Over the following months, I did research. I spent hours in the library, before the internet made research easy, going through old newspapers and historical records. I contacted other lookouts who had worked in that region, writing letters to addresses I found through the ranger service. Most did not respond. A few wrote back with polite but dismissive replies. Nobody wanted to talk about strange experiences in the forest. Nobody wanted to admit that something might exist out there that defied explanation. But I found one person, an old lookout named Thomas who had worked Tower 12-15 years before me. His letter was brief, just a few lines suggesting we meet in person if I was serious about discussing what I had seen. He gave me the name of a diner in the nearest town to the forest. I drove out there on a Saturday morning, my heart pounding with anticipation and nervousness. Thomas was in his 70s, his face weathered by decades of sun and wind. He was waiting in a corner booth, drinking coffee and looking out the window at the mountains in the distance. When I introduced myself, he gestured for me to sit down. "So you saw them," he said without preamble. It was not a question, he knew. "You saw them too," I replied, equally direct. "That is why you agreed to meet me." Thomas nodded slowly, his eyes still focused on the distant mountains. "I saw them. Not as many as you described in your letter, but I saw them. Just a few at first, then more each night. I lasted 12 days before I used the emergency radio to demand extraction. They thought I was crazy too, put it down to isolation psychosis. gave me my pay and sent me home. "What are they?" I asked, leaning forward. "What did we see?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, still staring out the window. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with years of contemplation and uncertainty. "I have spent 15 years trying to answer that question. I have read everything I could find about that forest, its history, the indigenous peoples who lived there before colonization. I have talked to old-timers who grew up in these mountains. I have theories, but no answers, just theories." "Tell me your theories, please. I need to know I am not crazy. I need to know someone else understands." He turned to look at me then, his eyes sad and knowing. "That forest is old, Vincent. Older than this country, older than any human settlement. The native peoples who lived there before the Europeans arrived, they had stories about that place. They avoided certain areas. They had rules about where you could go and where you could not go. They knew something existed in those deep places, something that did not belong to the human world." "What kind of something?" "Some places on this earth are not meant for us. Some places have their own rules, their own inhabitants, their own reality. The indigenous peoples understood this. They respected the boundaries. But when the Europeans came, when this land was colonized and mapped and claimed, those old boundaries were forgotten. We built our towers and our trails and our roads without understanding that we were intruding on something ancient." I absorbed his words, feeling a chill run down my spine despite the warm diner. "So what are the figures? Spirits? Ghosts?" "I do not think we have words for what they are. Our language, our concepts, they are built on the assumption that reality follows certain rules. But what if there are places where those rules do not apply? What if there are entities that exist in a space between what we call real and what we call impossible? Why did they surround the tower? What did they want?" Thomas shook his head. "I do not know. Maybe they were just watching. Maybe they were curious about the human who had invaded their territory. Maybe they were trying to communicate something we could not understand. Or maybe," he paused, seeming to reconsider his words. "Maybe what?" I pressed. "Maybe they were trying to warn us, to tell us we did not belong there, that we should leave before something worse happened." "What could be worse than what we experienced?" "I do not know, and I do not want to find out." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I wrote this down years ago. The things I learned from my research, from the stories the old-timers told me. I want you to have it. Maybe it will help you make sense of what happened, or maybe it will just give you more questions. Either way, you deserve to know you are not alone in this." I took the paper, unfolding it to find handwritten notes covering both sides. Names of indigenous tribes, references to academic papers, transcripts of interviews with elderly residents who remembered old stories. It was years of research, freely given to someone he had just met. "Why are you giving this to me?" I asked. "Because you are asking the right questions, because you did not just dismiss what you saw and move on. Because maybe, if enough of us piece together what we know, we can start to understand what is really happening in that forest." He stood up, leaving money on the table for his coffee. "Be careful, Vincent. Some knowledge comes with a price. Sometimes it is better not to know." He left the diner, and I sat there for a long time, reading his notes, feeling the weight of what he had given me. The research opened new doors, suggested new possibilities, but provided no definitive answers. Just more mystery, more questions, more reasons to believe that what I had experienced was real. Years passed. I went to college, got a degree, started a career in environmental science that had nothing to do with forests or lookout towers. I got married to a woman named Rachel who was patient with my occasional distant moods, my reluctance to go camping, my discomfort in deep wilderness. I bought a house in the suburbs, had kids, built a normal life that looked from the outside like any other middle-class existence. But the memory never faded. The image of those faceless figures pointing at me in the darkness remained as clear and vivid as the day I saw them. I would wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, my heart pounding, certain I heard scraping sounds on the stairs even though we lived in a single-story house. Rachel would wake too, concerned, asking if I was okay. I would tell her I was fine, just a nightmare, nothing to worry about. I never told her the whole story. How could I? She would think I was crazy or traumatized or making it up. Even now, after all these years of marriage, some experiences are too strange to share. Some memories are too unbelievable to speak aloud. If you have made it this far in my story, I want to thank you for listening. Please hit that like button and share this video if you think others should hear it. And leave a comment telling me if you believe me or if you have experienced something similar. I read every comment and your stories matter to me. They help me feel less alone. Now let me tell you about what happened when I finally went back. Last year I made a decision. I had to go back to Tower 12. I had to see it one more time to confront the place that had given me my most terrifying experience. Rachel thought I was insane when I told her, but she understood that I needed this closure. Our kids were grown and living on their own. We could afford for me to take a week and drive out to the forest. She made me promise to be careful, to check in every day, to come home if things felt wrong. I drove out to the Cascade Wilderness on a cool autumn morning, the trees already turning red and gold with the changing season. The ranger station was still there, though Patterson had retired years ago and the staff had completely turned over. Nobody remembered me or my brief, disastrous stint as a lookout. I explained that I used to work there and wanted to hike out to see my old tower. The current rangers were friendly and gave me a map and some safety advice, warnings about bears and the early snow that sometimes hit the high elevations this time of year. The hike took 6 hours. The trail was overgrown in places, less maintained than it had been in 1996. Budget cuts had reduced the ranger service's ability to maintain all the remote areas. When I finally emerged into the clearing, I saw Tower 12 rising above the trees exactly as I remembered it. The structure was abandoned now. More budget cuts had closed several of the remote towers, replacing human lookouts with satellite monitoring and aerial surveillance. But the tower itself was still standing, weathered and worn but intact. I stood at the edge of the clearing for a long time, just looking at it. Memories flooded back with overwhelming force. The isolation, the fear, the figures pointing at me in the darkness. My hands were shaking, and I had to force myself to walk forward, to cross the clearing toward the metal stairs that spiraled up the tower's legs. The stairs were rusty now, weakened by years of exposure to rain and snow. I tested each step carefully as I climbed, aware that a fall from this height could be fatal and that nobody knew exactly where I was. When I reached the cabin at the top and opened the door, I half expected to find it exactly as I had left it. But of course, it had been cleaned out years ago. The room was empty except for dust and dead insects. The windows were clouded with grime. The radio equipment was gone, probably removed when the tower was decommissioned. I walked to the window and looked out at the forest. The view was just as beautiful as I remembered. Miles of unbroken wilderness, peaceful and serene in the afternoon light. The trees swayed gently in the breeze. Birds called from the canopy below. Nothing moved in the clearing. No figures watched from the tree line. It was just a forest, just trees and sky and the natural world doing what it always did. I was about to leave when I noticed something carved into the wooden windowsill. Words scratched into the wood with a knife or some other sharp tool. The carving was old, weathered by time and the elements, but still legible. I bent down to read it, my heart beginning to pound as I made out the words. They are always watching, they are always waiting, do not stay after dark. Thomas 1981. My blood ran cold. Thomas had left a warning, carved where only someone standing exactly where I stood would see it. A warning I had never noticed during my 2 weeks in the tower. My attention always focused outward on the forest rather than down at the windowsill. How many others had stood in this exact spot over the years? How many had seen this warning? How many had ignored it or dismissed it as a joke? I looked at my watch. It was 4 p.m. I had plenty of time to hike back before sunset if I left immediately. But as I turned to leave, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. My entire body went rigid. Slowly, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to run, I turned back to the window and looked down at the clearing. They were there. Just a few at first, emerging from the tree line one by one. Dark figures with no faces standing motionless at the edge of the clearing, watching, waiting. As I stared, more appeared. 5, then 10, then 20. They were assembling again, reforming their circle, taking up their vigil as if I had never left, as if the past 28 years had not happened at all. I did not stay to see how many would come. I did not wait to see if they would start pointing. I ran down the stairs as fast as the rusted metal would allow, my feet slipping on corroded steps, my hands barely catching the railing when I stumbled. I ran across the clearing without looking back, plunged into the forest, and followed the trail back toward the ranger station. I moved as fast as the rough terrain would allow, my 50-year-old body protesting the exertion, but driven by the same primal fear I had felt at 19. I did not stop to rest. I did not look behind me. I just kept moving, pushing through the pain in my legs and the burning in my lungs until I reached my car as the sun was setting. My clothes were soaked with sweat, my hands scratched from branches I had pushed through without care. As I started the engine, I looked in my rearview mirror one last time. The forest was dark now, the tower invisible among the trees. But somewhere in that darkness, I knew they were still there, still watching, still waiting for the next person who would take the job at Tower 12, or the next foolish man who would return to a place he should have left behind forever. That was 1 year ago. I have not been back since. And I never will. But I think about it every day. I think about those figures and what they might be. I think about Thomas and his warning carved into the windowsill, a message left for future guardians who would ignore it just as I had. And I wonder about all the other people who might have seen them over the years, people who were dismissed as crazy or stressed or unable to handle the isolation. Rachel asked me when I got home if I had found the closure I was looking for. I lied and said yes, but the truth is that going back only made things worse. It confirmed that what I experienced in 1996 was not a product of isolation or stress or a 19-year-old's overactive imagination. It was real. It is still real. And it is still happening in that forest, in that tower, in that space between what we call possible and what we call impossible. If you have ever worked in a remote location and experienced something you could not explain, something that nobody believed when you tried to tell them about it, I want you to know that you are not alone. There are places in this world where reality works differently, where things exist that we cannot understand or categorize or explain away with logic and reason. Tower 12 is one of those places. There are others. I know this because after I shared my story online, after I started this channel and began talking about what happened to me, people started reaching out. Former lookouts from all over the country, from different forests and different towers, all with similar stories. Figures in the trees, breathing on the radio, scraping sounds on the stairs. The details varied, but the core experience was the same. Something was watching, something was waiting. We are trying to piece together what it all means. We are comparing notes, mapping the locations, looking for patterns that might explain what these entities are and what they want. Some people think they are spirits of the original inhabitants of these lands, displaced and angry. Others think they are manifestations of the forest itself, the wilderness pushing back against human intrusion. Still others believe they are something else entirely. Entities from dimensions that overlap with ours in certain places under certain conditions. I do not know which theory is correct. Maybe none of them are. Maybe the truth is something we do not have the concepts or language to understand. But I am telling this story because people need to know. If you are considering a job as a fire lookout, if you are planning to spend time alone in the deep wilderness, you need to be aware that you might not be as alone as you think. Pay attention to the rules, both the official ones and the unofficial ones left by those who came before you. Read the warnings carved into windowsills and written in old logbooks. Listen to the stories that other lookouts tell, even the ones that sound impossible. And if you start seeing figures in the forest, if you hear breathing on the radio, if something starts climbing the stairs in the middle of the night, do not dismiss it as imagination. Trust your instincts and get out. Some places should be left alone, some towers should stay empty, and some warnings should be heeded. I just wish I had seen Thomas's message before I took that job in 1996. I wish someone had told me that Tower 12 was different, that it sat in a place where the normal rules did not apply, that taking that position would mark me for life. But nobody told me, just as nobody told Thomas, just as nobody will tell the next person who takes that job. Because the Ranger Service does not believe these stories. They attribute them to isolation and stress and psychological breakdown. They will continue to staff Tower 12 when budget allows, continue to send young people up there alone for months at a time, continue to dismiss their reports when they see something that should not exist. And the figures will continue to watch, continue to wait, continue to point at whoever occupies that cabin 70 feet above the forest floor. If you are still with me after this entire story, I appreciate you more than you know. I have been carrying this experience for 28 years, and telling it to you has been like lifting a weight I did not know I was carrying. Please hit that subscribe button if you want to hear more accounts like this one. I have been collecting stories from other lookouts, other people who have seen things in the wilderness that defy explanation. Their stories deserve to be heard too. And remember, the next time you are alone in the wilderness, pay attention to the shadows. Sometimes they are watching back. Sometimes they are more than just the absence of light. Sometimes they are something else entirely, something ancient and patient and utterly beyond our understanding. Leave a comment below telling me what you would have done in my situation. Would you have stayed in that tower? Would you have run sooner? Do you believe my story, or do you think it was all in my head? I want to know because your perspective matters. Your voice adds to the conversation. And maybe, just maybe, together we can start to understand what is really happening in places like Tower 12. My name is Vincent, and this is what happened to me in the summer of 1996. This is my truth, my testimony, my warning. I was 19 years old when I learned that the world is stranger and more terrifying than anything I had been taught to believe. I am 47 now, and that lesson has stayed with me every single day. The figures are still out there. They are still watching Tower 12 and other towers like it, scattered throughout the wilderness areas of this country. They are still waiting for the next person who will see them, who will experience what I experienced, who will have their understanding of reality shattered by something that should not exist but does. I hope that person is not you. But if it is, if you find yourself in a lonely tower in the deep forest and you start seeing things that do not make sense, remember that you are not crazy. You are not alone. Others have been where you are. Others have seen what you are seeing, and we believe you even if nobody else does. Stay safe out there, and whatever you do, do not stay in Tower 12 after dark. Thank you for listening.